Money printer goes BRR. China just announced that they're easing their monetary policy to levels not seen since 2010. The Bitcoin party can now begin. This could pump Bitcoin to new highs. Even though the Bitcoin price is dipping a bit today, this is a very, very positive development for Bitcoin because increasing liquidity means rising Bitcoin prices. We now have a massive change in monetary policy in China that isn't going into effect just yet, but it has been decided and will take effect in 2025. It even says here, we will ease our monetary policy moderately. This means that we are talking about easing here, and easing always means quantitative easing, which means buying government bonds. That's always been my thesis. Sure, low interest rate policies in the US and Europe are nice and all, but Bitcoin is really going to take off when central banks start doing quantitative easing. And now we actually have the first major central bank that seems to want to kick off quantitative easing in 2025. Of course, they're saying it will be done moderately at first, but we've seen with other quantitative easing attempts and experiments that it always starts off moderately and then escalates pretty quickly, like we've seen in other cases. And now we actually have the first major central bank that seems to want to kick off quantitative easing in 2025. Of course, they're starting off by saying moderately, but we've seen with other, let's say, quantitative easing attempts and experiments, it always starts off moderately and then escalates pretty quickly, like we saw during the COVID times and so on. And what's important here is that this is basically the most drastic change in monetary policy since 2011. We've seen this during the COVID times and so on. And what is also important here is that this is basically the most drastic change in monetary policy since 2011. We're returning to the 2010 state post-crisis when markets were flooded with money. Now, China is doing the same by lowering rates and buying bonds. Printing money refers to these actions, not literal cash printing. This involves bank and credit money creation. It's not entirely accurate to say money is just printed, but it's a common expression. The Chinese stock market rose nearly 4% positively. New money acts as a necessary lubricant for our fiat economy. There is bank money creation, there is credit money creation through, let's say, bond purchase programs and so on. So technically, it's not entirely accurate when I say that money is just being printed, but colloquially, you can put it that way. The Chinese stock market also jumped almost 4% right away because China reacted very positively to this. New money is like the lubricant that our current fiat economy needs because without that lubricant, it just doesn't work. By the way, before we go any further into the China issue and why it is so massively bullish for Bitcoin, I actually want to apologize here. So, I uploaded a video earlier where I accused the journalist from Wirtschaftswoche, Gabriele Bohm, of something. I thought she was the one who published the article. But then I noticed, because a lot of users commented saying, no, it wasn't Gabriele Bohm at all, it was actually Nicholas Hoyer. I thought she was the one who published the article. But I noticed that a lot of users commented saying, no, it wasn't Gabriele Bohm at all, it was actually Nicholas Hoyer. So I want to officially apologize to Ms. Bohm. I actually misread that, and she wasn't the author after all. So to be clear, I'm obviously not a perfect person. I'm doing this more or less as a one-man show. Mistakes can definitely happen here, but if I do make mistakes, I have no problem correcting myself. So big shout out and a huge apology. But now let's keep going with China, because what's happening there is super interesting. You can see all over Twitter right now posts about big bullish news like money printer go BRR and stuff like that. I mean, China has been hinting for a while now about announcing some packages and whatever else. But now there's been the official decision that we're going to take a look at. A post says that the Politburo announced it will pursue a moderate easing of monetary policy by 2025, which is the first major shift in its stance since 2011. There were also promises to stabilize the real estate and stock markets. These statements gave some investors confidence that the authorities are determined to support the economy in light of growing trade conflicts, which led to an immediate boost in sentiment. What you also have to say is that China probably has the biggest real estate Ponzi scheme in the world going on if they don't pump a ton of money into it. They have built entire zombie nations, entire zombie cities, where in the end all the buildings are empty simply to create speculative bubbles. So they're really pumping up the real estate market to keep the whole Ponzi scheme running. You could just say, okay, let it go bankrupt, but it would cause unrest due to lost pensions. And if we just let this thing crash into the wall, then of course I would say that would be good in the long term because the bubbles would deflate. But in the short term, it would ensure that there would be massive discontent, that there would be uprisings, whatever, because people would lose their pensions, their savings, and so on. And that is why the decision has been made not only to keep the weak economy alive, but also to keep the asset bubbles alive with new, cheap money. And Bitcoin is really the big winner here because a lot of that money is going to flow into Bitcoin. Now, you have to say, it's not like they're starting quantitative easing and on the first day Bitcoin just goes straight to the moon. That takes time. First, the money has to flow into the economy, and then it has to flow into Bitcoin. It could take 2 months, 3 months, but it definitely suggests that next year the bull run could be even stronger. And my theory or my prediction is that these actions happening in China will eventually also take place in the US and Europe. That Christine Lagarde says, hey, interest rate cuts are not enough. We now also have to ease. We also have to do quantitative easing. That Jerome Powell is saying, hey, interest rate cuts aren't enough. We need more money packages, stimulus packages. We need to ease, do quantitative easing. And then the Bitcoin rocket is really going to take off. In another report, it says that China will implement a more proactive fiscal policy and a moderate, loose monetary policy next year. China will also be determined to boost consumption and expand domestic demand in all areas. So they want to strengthen the economy on multiple levels. And then we actually have Michael Saylor, who strikes again and buys Bitcoin. In the end, when he announces that he bought the Bitcoin, he actually bought it last week. So it doesn't currently have any impact on the Bitcoin price, but we've confirmed Michael Saylor's new purchases. And I noticed something really interesting here. Check out this statistic. Here you can see the frequency and the number of Bitcoin purchases by Michael Saylor. If you take a look here, you can see it started off pretty slow in 2021, 2022, 2023. And here in 2024, around the middle of the year, Michael Saylor's Bitcoin purchases really shot up massively. This is definitely an exponential development, with the purchases increasing like crazy. This means that trust in Bitcoin has continued to grow. We see a shift from a gradual credit phase to an exponential phase. 2 days ago, I released a video with Adam Beck, who said we are transitioning from slow to exponential adoption. And that's basically what other people are talking about. Just 2 days ago, I released a video featuring Adam Beck, who basically said the same thing, that we're slowly transitioning from the slow adoption phase into an exponential adoption phase. With Michael Saylor, we can definitely see this development already. Michael Saylor is probably 1 or 2 years ahead of the mainstream here. So I wouldn't say that the suddenly phase has fully hit the mainstream just yet. It may take another 2 or 3 years before it reaches the mainstream. It may also never happen because many people assume diminishing returns. The suddenly incredulity theory assumes that we essentially have diminishing returns, and at a certain tipping point where the network effects are so strong, Bitcoin will take off exponentially. Because in the end, we always have that S-shaped adoption curve with disruptive technologies. That is the big question, whether we have exponential growth here or whether we have linearly declining returns. So that means we're getting less return each year, 50%, 40%, 30%, 20%, and then after 100 years, it just levels off more and more. And the suddenly incredibly theory suggests that we have diminishing returns until we hit a tipping point where we really shoot up exponentially. At that point, we could see returns of 60%, 70%, 80%, or even 200%, 300% over a longer period, so exponential growth. But eventually, that will also taper off at some point. But then we have a phase of 5, 6, 7 years where there are really massive, let's say, advancements in Bitcoin adoption. Very interesting. Feel free to drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'm pretty neutral on this. I can't really gauge whether this is going to break out exponentially or if we're actually going to see diminishing returns. I would have said diminishing returns, but more and more people are leaning towards a stock to FOMO model, where Bitcoin could really break out exponentially for maybe 5 or 6 years, until it stabilizes a bit. And then there was also an interesting development. I'm currently in El Salvador, and El Salvador has now issued its Bitcoin bonds, which are in high demand on the international market. I think the most sought-after Bitcoin or the most in-demand bonds in all emerging markets right now are El Salvador's Bitcoin bonds and what they're issuing. Their bonds have also seen a massive boost in the rankings. And now there are actually threats coming from the International Monetary Fund again. Here, El Salvador says they will only get the $1.3 billion loan if they declare Bitcoin as an official currency. Not as mandatory, but as voluntary. I don't think it's a bad idea to declare it as voluntary, but I also have to say that no one is being forced to accept Bitcoin here. There are actually a lot of stores in El Salvador that don't accept Bitcoin. So it's basically just a marketing strategy that Bukele is using. Bitcoin is legal tender in El Salvador, but this is rarely enforced. So like in Argentina, they say, yeah, free trade, you can pay your bills, your taxes, you can make contracts in whatever currency you want. Here in El Salvador, it's clearly stated that Bitcoin is legal tender, so it's an official currency and must be accepted. But that's just the legal text. In practice, it's never really enforced. I've never heard of anyone having problems here for not accepting Bitcoin. On the contrary, people are actually helped or given support and stuff like that. So that means the IMF is demanding that El Salvador backs down. Here you can see the insidious maneuvers of the IMF. I think El Salvador might not even have to be blackmailed because they're in such a good position now. I'm really curious to see how Bukele reacts to this. It would be really interesting to see the ultra move. That would be the ultra smart move. He's actually taking the loan from the International Monetary Fund and using it to buy Bitcoin, making Bitcoin no longer an official currency but a voluntary one, while still buying Bitcoin with that money. That would be the ultimate chess move, the ultimate marketing move. But I don't know if there are any other conditions, because if he does that, I mean, it wasn't listed in the conditions that he can't buy Bitcoin with it, but I think he could really mess things up with the IMF. On the other hand, from what I understand, he wants to move away from the IMF anyway, and that would be the ultimate smart move. He takes a loan from the IMF, buys Bitcoin with it, and within a year or two, he sees such massive price increases that he can pay back the loan along with all the other IMF loans and then be completely free from the IMF. I mean, that would definitely be ultra smart. And then there's actually a very bullish piece of news, 21 Bitcoin, which I always support and highly recommend as an app for buying Bitcoin because it's super easy and cheap. They want to become the safest Bitcoin app in Europe, so the safest Bitcoin offering, and they're scaling up and bringing in new top people like Philip Nicolasinski, who is responsible for the security behind this app. So it's always very important, for example, when buying Bitcoin, you shouldn't just do it on any unregulated exchanges or anything like that, where they could pull a rug pull or just take your money or something. Instead, you should really go for platforms that are maybe even Bitcoin only, that are genuinely focused on security, and that might actually have support from people who know what they're doing. Philip says here, I am happy to support 21 Bitcoin's mission to make Bitcoin not only accessible, but also secure for everyone. Together, we're going to build the safest Bitcoin financing service platform in the EU, and that's a bullish statement. I'm ultra bullish on 21 Bitcoin. I'm ultra bullish on Bitcoin. I'll drop a link down below on how you can save up to 20% on fees when buying Bitcoin. It's also possible with the code Bitcoin Hotel. I absolutely recommend checking it out if you don't have a way to buy Bitcoin yet. 21 Bitcoin is definitely the recommendation here, although you have to decide for yourselves whether to buy Bitcoin or not. I can't decide that for you. Of course, this isn't financial advice or anything like that. Let me know in the comments below what you think about the massive movements in China. See you later. Peace out. Usend.